Hi everyone, my name is Rachel and I'm the Innovation Lab Specialist at the Clear Lake City County Freeman Branch Library. In this video, I'll demonstrate some beginner cross-stitch patterns, which are available while supplies last in our beginner cross-stitch kits on the second floor of the Clear Lake City County Freeman Branch Library. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Friends of Freeman Library. This program was made possible thanks to funding from them. You can support the Friends of Freeman Library by visiting their bookstore on the first floor of the Freeman Branch Library and by visiting their website and social media. This won't be a demonstration of cross-stitching a pattern from start to finish. In this video, I'll explain what Aida cloth is, how to thread the needle with basic sewing thread, how to base stitch the center lines, how to mount the fabric in an embroidery hoop, how to thread the needle with embroidery floss, how to start the first row, how to stitch the second row, how to remove a knot, how to end a strand and start another, how to stitch around the basting stitches, how to skip blank squares, and how to remove the basting stitches. In your kit is a square of Aida cloth, which is a fabric that's evenly woven with a specific number of squares to the inch called the count. If you look closely, you can see the fabric is made up of several squares. This is a 14-inch count Aida cloth, so there's 14 squares per inch. This is the most popular size for cross-stitch patterns. Aida cloth is popular for cross-stitching because the holes make it easy to push the needle through the cloth. The edges of your cloth are frayed because I cut the fabric down to size. It's nothing to worry about, especially if you're planning to cut the cloth down to fit in a frame or in your own hoop. If you really want to fix the fraying though, I included in the cross-stitch kits a list of supplies you can purchase at hobby and sewing stores. Because we're working with designs that are counted from charts like this, you might want to mark the center lines with a darker colored pen or marker. This will make it easier to keep track of where you are in the pattern. You can base stitch the center lines of your fabric so it will match the center lines on your pattern. This can help you keep track of your stitch placement. Basting stitches are temporary stitches that you're going to remove later when you're done with your cross-stitch pattern. You can also use a water-soluble fabric pen, which is available at hobby and sewing stores. With that pen, you can draw the center lines and then wash it off later with some water. I'll demonstrate how to base stitch the center lines. First, you'll thread your needle with the basic sewing thread that's included in the kit. It's a thin, dark thread wound on a paper bobbin. Unwind the thread, and about 18 inches or an arm's length should be enough. Take some scissors and cut the sewing thread. You can find your sewing needle in this little 3D printed case in your kit. Just pull off the cap and take your needle out. We're using a size 24 tapestry needle, which is good for cross-stitching because it has a large eye that the embroidery floss can fit through. It also has a dull tip, which is good because you're stitching through holes in the cloth, so it doesn't need to be sharp to push the needle through. Grab one end of the sewing thread and push it through the eye of the needle. This takes a little patience, so it's okay if it takes some time for you to thread the needle. Once the thread is through the eye of the needle, pull the thread through about halfway like this. Then, grab the two ends, or the tails, of the thread and hold them between your index finger and thumb. Hold the eye of the needle between that same finger and thumb. Grab this end of the thread and wrap it around your needle a few times. Pull it towards your finger and thumb and hold on to that. With your other finger and thumb, grab the needle and pull it away until a knot forms at the end of your thread. Next, fold your fabric in half horizontally. Lightly press the edge of the fabric so it will leave a mark for the center line. Then, fold the fabric vertically and press that edge down. Flip the fabric over with the back facing up and push the needle down through one of the center holes near the bottom of the fabric. Flip the fabric back over to the front and pull the needle through. The knot should keep the thread from pulling out of the fabric. Push the needle through the front of the fabric a few holes up from where you came out on your vertical center line. Then repeat this until you make a vertical center line with your thread. Don't pull the thread to make these stitches too tight. You want to keep it loose so it's easy to remove later. Instead of basting the centers, I've seen some people draw out a grid on their patterns and then baste a matching grid on their Aida cloth. If that's something you're interested in learning how to do, let me know and I can make a demonstration video of that. I'm really excited to do more cross-stitching and embroidery projects in the future for the library. I find it to be very calming. Once you're at the end of your fabric, you should have extra thread on your needle. Flip your fabric over to the back and thread your needle through the last stitch to make a loop. Don't pull your needle tight all the way through. Push your needle through the loop you just made to make a smaller loop. Again, don't pull your needle tight. Now push your needle through the small loop. Pull your needle tight to make a knot. Use some scissors to cut the remaining thread from your needle. That thread should be secured in your fabric. You can also cut off the extra tail end at the bottom knot so it's nice and neat. Just be careful not to cut too much or the knot could unravel. These stitches should be loose so they'll be easy to cut later with some scissors. Now repeat the same instructions to baste the horizontal center line. Next, I'll show you how to mount the cloth in the embroidery hoop. Unscrew your hoop until it's loose enough that you can remove the inner hoop. Lay the inner hoop down on a flat surface. Take your cloth and center it on the inner hoop. It might take a bit of eyeballing to generally arrange the fabric in the center. Grab the outer hoop and gently press it down around the inner hoop. It does take some practice to get this part right, so don't worry if the rings don't fit together right away. Once those hoops are snapped in place, screw them back together until the fabric is taut. Some people say that plastic embroidery hoops are easier to assemble. I haven't used those before. These wooden embroidery hoops are at hobby and sewing stores, so they're easy to get if you want your own for cross-stitching at home or for displaying your finished patterns. Okay, so my fabric is firmly in the hoop. If you need to move your fabric later to reach another area, take it out of the hoop first because you can damage the fabric if you try to move it while the hoops are screwed together. I also recommend taking the fabric out of the hoop when you're not working on your cross-stitch pattern because it can leave a mark in the fabric and I'm not sure if that can be ironed out. Next, I'll demonstrate how to thread your needle with the embroidery floss. Before we do that, mark an X at the center of your pattern like this. When you're more advanced at cross-stitching, you can start your pattern wherever you want, but it's best to start at the center when you're a beginner. Grab the bundle or skein of the first color of embroidery floss that you're going to stitch with. The skeins look like this in your kit, and there should be a string that you can pull out. I'll be using this bobbin, which some of you might have in your kit. Gently tap the end of the embroidery floss. You can see that it's made out of several strands of thread. These skeins are made out of 6 strands of thread. The designs in these cross-stitch kits are 2-strand patterns, which is standard for basic cross-stitch patterns. Normally, you would pull 18 inches of 2 floss strands, but I thread my needle a different way, which I think is a bit easier. I pull out 1 strand, but the way I thread my needle will result in 2 strands. Pull 36 inches or 3 feet of embroidery floss. Grab some scissors and cut the strands. You probably won't need all 6 strands for this color, but I find it easier to pull and cut all 6 strands instead of just 1 so that they don't get tangled. Tap the end of the strands that you cut so you can separate out 1 strand of floss. Pull that 1 strand out from the others. Grab the ends of the strand between your index finger and thumb. Then, with your other index finger and thumb, pull along the strands to the other end until a loop forms. Use your index finger and thumb to make this loop as small as possible, because you need to push that loop through the eye of your needle. When the loop is through the eye of the needle, pull that loop through the eye a bit, and then push the tip end of your needle through that loop and pull until a tight knot forms on the needle's eye. This secures the embroidery floss on the needle, and you can see that this resulted in 2 strands. I like threading my needle like this because it's more secure than threading and folding 2 separate strands over the needle. However, there are different ways to thread your needle, so you might find another way that works better for you. There are also different ways to start a cross stitch. I don't know if there is a name for the method I use. We're going to start at the center of our pattern, so I'm going to start with the red heart on this I Love Books pattern. I'll begin with this left square on the bottom row of the heart, so I need to count out how many squares it is to the right of the pattern center. That bottom left square is 5 squares to the right of the center. We always start from the bottom left of a square, so you don't need to move up a square. So again, we're only counting across, not up. On the fabric, I'm going to count 5 squares to the right of the center. There's a couple of different ways you can get the needle through the back of the fabric to the front. From the front of the fabric, you can push the needle through the hole and wiggle it a bit to make the hole bigger so you can see it from the back of the fabric. But if that's still hard to see, you can also just count the holes from the back. Just remember, on the back you need to count in the opposite direction, so you'd count 5 squares to the left of the center. Push the needle through to the front of the fabric, but don't push it all the way through because we're going to make a knot. Flip the hoop over to the front. We're going to stitch 3 half stitches to form the bottom row of the heart. When you stitch left to right, you always go from the bottom left hole to the top right hole of a square. You can see that where we pushed the needle through the fabric made it so that the needle is already at that bottom left hole of the square. Push the needle through the top right hole of the square. Again, don't pull your thread tight all the way through because we need to make a knot. Flip your hoop to the back and pull this strand's tail to the left so it's out of the way. Push your needle through the hole below where your needle just came out. This is going to make a loop that catches the tail. Now we'll stitch the next 2 half stitches to secure that tail. Flip your hoop back to the front, and you'll see again that your needle is already through the bottom left hole of the next square. Push your needle through the top right hole of that square. Flip your hoop to the back and hold that tail out of the way again. Push the needle through the hole below where you just came out. Flip the hoop over to the front. The needle should be at the bottom left hole of the next square. Push your needle through the top right hole of that square. Flip your hoop over to the back. Hold the tail out of the way again and push the needle through the hole below where you just came out. Now the tail is secured by 3 half stitches. Cut the extra thread on the back so the tail is nice and neat. Next, we'll stitch half stitches in the opposite direction, which will form the full cross stitches. Each square will look like an X. When you stitch from right to left, you always go from the bottom right hole to the top left hole. Just a heads up, the last stitch on a row is always different, so don't jump ahead. From that bottom right hole, push your needle through the top left hole of the square. Flip your hoop over to the back. You're going to push your needle through the same bottom holes of each stitch like earlier, so your needle will end up at the bottom right hole of each square. Flip your hoop to the front. Push your needle through the top left hole of the next square. We're at the last cross stitch for this row. Let's look at the pattern. To start the next row up on the heart, the row with the 5 squares, your needle needs to end up at the bottom left hole on that far left square of the row. This is why the last cross stitch on every row is going to be different. Looking at the front of your hoop, the needle should push through the back of the fabric to the top left hole of that left square. Now push your needle through the bottom right hole of that square. Flip your hoop over to the back. Push your needle 1 hole to the right of where you just came out. Pull your needle through, and you'll see that it's now at the bottom left hole of the far left square on the next row up. I'm going to stitch the next row so you can all see this again. If you have any questions, you can always call the library or visit us, and I can answer your questions. If you would like this in the future to be a live virtual class, please let us know that you're interested. The second row of the heart is made up of 5 cross stitches. The needle is already at the bottom left hole of the left square, so push the needle through the top right hole of that square. From the back of the fabric, push the needle through the hole below where the needle just came out. From the bottom left hole of the next square, push your needle through the top right hole of the square. Flip your hoop over to the back. Push your needle through the hole below, the one the needle just came through. From the bottom left hole of the next square, push your needle through the top right hole of the same square. Push the needle through the hole below the one it just came through. I accidentally tangled the thread and a knot formed on the embroidery floss. Sometimes this can be easily fixed without cutting your thread, so don't panic if this happens to you. I'm just gently pulling the two strands away from the knot. Go slow and gentle so you don't rip the thread. You can also try using your needle to wedge in the knot and loosen it up. I'm going to push my needle backward through the cloth so the strands are longer and I have more to pull from. I was able to remove the knot by gently pulling the strands, but if you can't get the knot out, try pulling the strands to tighten that knot so it will get small enough that it can be pulled through the holes in the Aida cloth. You just have to be careful when you do that because you need to use a little bit of pressure when you're pulling the knot through the holes, but you're gentle enough that you're not going to rip the thread. Otherwise, if you can't get that knot out, you will have to cut the strands on your needle and pull the cross stitches out of the cloth. Then you'll have to restart those stitches with a new strand. This will only affect the stitches that were made by that strand, so it's not going to affect your entire cross stitch pattern. Alright, we're back at the bottom left hole of the next square. Push your needle through the top right hole of that square. You can hold the thread out of the way to keep it from knotting. Flip your hoop to the back. Push your needle through the hole below where it just came out. Flip your hoop to the front and push your needle through the top right hole of the next square. Flip your hoop to the back. Push your needle through the hole below where it just came out. This is the fifth half stitch. Push your needle through the top right hole of that square. The 5 left to right half stitches are done. Flip your hoop to the back. Push your needle through the hole below where it just came out. Pull the needle through to the front of the fabric. Now the needle is at the bottom right hole of the far right square on that row, and we'll complete the cross stitches by going right to left. Push your needle through the top left hole of that square. Flip your hoop to the back. Push your needle through the hole below where it just came out. I accidentally did that one wrong. As you can see, it's easy to fix mistakes. I'm using the needle's tip to pull that half stitch out. That's why the Aida cloth is so great, because the holes are big enough that you can push the needle and embroidery floss backwards through the front, and you can redo that half stitch. I'm going to take extra care to make sure I'm pushing my needle through the correct hole. It's always good to double check by pushing the needle through the hole just a bit, and then checking the other side of the fabric to make sure the needle is in the right place. I have my needle where it needs to be, so I'm pulling the needle through. Now, push your needle through the top left hole of that square. Flip your hoop to the back and push your needle through the hole below the one it just came through. Flip your hoop to the front and push your needle through the top left hole of the square. Flip your hoop to the back and push your needle through the hole below the one it just came through. Flip your hoop to the front and, once more, push your needle through the top left hole of the square. The fourth half stitch is done. Remember, the last cross stitch is always going to be different because we want the needle to end up at the bottom left hole of the left square on the next row up. Looking at the front of the hoop, the needle should be coming through the top left hole of that far left square. Pull the needle through, and then push the needle through the bottom right hole of that square. Flip your hoop to the back. Push your needle one hole to the right of where it came out so that it will now be at the bottom left hole of the far left square on the next row up. Next, I'll demonstrate what to do when you run out of embroidery floss on your needle and need to add more. It's time to stitch the next row, but I don't think I have enough floss to complete all 15 cross stitches, so I'm going to have to add a new strand of my needle. But first, I need to end this thread, so I'm going to push it through the stitches that I made earlier like this. This is similar to how we secured the tail at the beginning of the thread, but instead of stitching over the tail, we're pushing the tail through the stitches that have already been made on the back of the fabric. I'm just pushing the needle through a few of these stitches. You don't need to push it through the entire row. Doing this will secure the entire strand of floss, so it won't come out of the fabric when the thread is cut off the needle. When you're done, cut the strand off your needle. Be careful not to cut too close to the stitches, or the strand could come loose. Now you can thread the needle again with a new strand to start the next row. You'll notice that the next row is right against the basting stitches. That's why it's great these stitches are loose, because it's easy to pull those stitches out of the way with your finger. We're going to push the needle through the back of the fabric so it goes through the bottom left hole of the far left square on this row. Remember, don't pull your needle and thread through the fabric all the way because you need to leave a tail on the back. Push your needle through the top right hole of the square. Flip your hoop to the back and hold the tail out of the way. Push your needle through the hole below where it just came out so you can catch that tail in a loop. Now just repeat that step to secure the tail. Since this row has more stitches than the previous rows, I'm going to secure the tail in the first 5 stitches. When you're done securing the tail, cut off the excess thread so that it's nice and neat. And then you just keep stitching your rows. This I Love Books pattern is a great beginner cross-stitch pattern because there aren't any connecting shapes. There are some tips I want to show y'all on the other design, and these tips can be used for all the patterns in the cross-stitch kits. Then I'll show y'all how to remove the basting stitches for when you finish cross-stitching. This design is a little more complicated because there are some connecting shapes, but it's still beginner-friendly. When I worked on the last pattern, whenever there were some blank blocks, like here on the K, I would go around that blank block. So I would continue my strand up one side of the K, end the strand, and then start another strand to stitch the other side of the K. I did the same with the O, so I would stitch my thread up this side of the O, and then I would start a new strand to stitch up the other side. On this design, you can see that there's one blank block in the O, Instead of stitching up one side and starting a new strand for the other, I'm going to skip this blank block. This works when you have one or two blank blocks. I stitched the first 2 half stitches on this row. However, the second stitch will actually be different. You're not going to push your needle through the next hole because we're skipping that next square. I'm going to push my needle backward through the cloth so I can redo that second half stitch. Instead of pushing the needle through the hole below where it just came out, you're going to push the needle through the hole below on the square to the left. Pull your needle through that hole. Flip your hoop over to the front and you'll see that the needle skipped the blank square. When this row is complete, there should be 4 cross stitches with a blank square that you skipped in the middle. This is a lot easier than using multiple strands to stitch up sides of a letter. You can keep following that continuous side-to-side motion of cross-stitching. You can use that method on most of this design, such as on the R, the A, the D, and the E's. This method can be used on any of the designs in the cross-stitch kits. However, remember that skipping blank squares only really works if you have 1 or 2. It's not the best method if you have 3 or more blocks because the stitch on the back will be too long. After you finish cross-stitching the entire pattern, you're going to cut out the basting stitches. It's okay if you stitched the embroidery floss over the basting stitches because these stitches are loose and will be easy to pull out. Sometimes you might need some tweezers to pull out the basting stitches, but most of the time you'll only need some scissors to cut them, and then you can pull those out with your fingers. I'll show 2 examples of removing basting stitches. With this I Love Books pattern, I didn't stitch the embroidery floss over the basting stitches, so these will be easy to remove. I only needed to cut the thread with some scissors, and then I gently pulled the thread out of the fabric. With this other design though, I did accidentally stitch the embroidery floss over the basting stitches. I'm going to cut the basting stitch thread a few times with my scissors so that it will be shorter and easier to pull out. Then I'll use my fingers to gently pull the thread out from the embroidery floss. The basting thread is pretty stuck here, so I'm going to flip my fabric over so I can try pulling the thread from the back. I'll keep cutting the thread a few times so it's shorter and easier to pull. I've got a tiny thread that's really stuck here, so I'll use some tweezers to pull out that thread. When using tweezers, be careful not to pull out the embroidery floss. For the rest of this pattern, I'm going to keep cutting the thread short and using tweezers to pull any thread that I can't pull out with my fingers. Alright, so we have our finished designs. These are simple and easy patterns for beginner cross-stitching. If you want to stitch more patterns or learn more cross-stitching methods, please let us know. There are lots of different cross-stitching and embroidery methods, different knots and stitches, and lots of materials that can be used. We'd be happy to host more programs like this. If you have any questions or need any help, please visit the Freeman Branch Library. Once again, I would like to thank the Friends of Freeman Library for funding this program. Thank you all so much and have a great day.